North Carolina University, in concert with, see if I can say this right, Protiviti, conducted their annual survey of executives for 2017, and they tend to use risk as a lens. I've looked at this survey before. And of course, in doing so, they've identified the top 10 issues of risk from a macro to operational scale using the lens of risk. The results point to higher perceived risk, except by board members, which is an interesting thing that I'm sure my guests today will comment on. And there's clearly no plans to address these issues, at least not through risk management. The question, of course, that this raises in my mind is, could this be because executives are leaning toward using risks instead of preventing risks and mitigating them and controlling them? And that's where agility can actually be gained and innovation, of course. You're listening to the Insight to Action podcast. My name is Donna Jones. My work is in the area of transformation in terms of personal right through to global, using the lens of decision-making, mindset, and leadership. And with me today is Dave West of Scrum.org. And Dave works with executives and boards on understanding and gaining greater agility through Agile and through agility. So that's a banding about words. Somebody wrote on LinkedIn the other day, hey, don't we have too much agility? And I thought, well, maybe in at least in conversation, but not so much in action, or mindset. So Dave, if we look back, the past would suggest trying to manage and control risk. But is it possible that gaining agility is a better way of dealing with the rapid change we've got in the world today?
Hi, and that's a really interesting question. And gosh, there's lots of things to talk about, particularly the fact that board members don't seem to be as worried as everybody else, which is probably even more worrying, maybe. But the concept of risk, it's I can't help but be reminded of Karate Kid, the 80s film that was, paint the wall, wax on, wax off. That he talks in that, and obviously David Carradine in Kung Fu before that said, that there's many ways of dealing with the world, but when you've got a lot of like movement, and you need to go with it, you need to sort of relax and you need to be like a reed rather than a stick, and ultimately I think that risk is a fundamental part of any thing that you're doing. If you just change a single field on a website or release a patch to your self-driving algorithms on your car, they're both risky for different reasons, and the outcomes are never predetermined. As we move into more and more complex products and systems, the risk just increases. So to manage risk in a very traditional way, I think would be naive, and I think that the survey illustrates that. I think that the only way you manage risk in this modern world is by doing and by observing. You sort of inspect and adapt. You respond to change. You basically deliver frequently and observe the behavior of that, and then get ready to take it out very quickly. It's almost like you don't have risk mitigation. You have the ability to remove it. It's sort of when you see it's gone wrong. So I think that ultimately, this survey highlights the fact that our management discipline is finally realizing that you can't respond in a totally proactive way to risk and manage the hell out of it. You have to just respond when the risks occur. Also, the thing that strikes me is that how many times have we spent millions of dollars dealing with a situation that never happens?
Absolutely.
I don't know if you've ever seen this on projects, and particularly us engineers, and I'm a self-confessed software engineer, or I guess I should say software craftsman. Oh no, maybe I should say software artist. I never know what I should say now. But ultimately, I've spent so much time sitting in meetings where there's always a guy that finds every possible combination of everything, and then we spend weeks building that software, and then then in 2 years' time we approach it and we realize that nobody ever went to that part of the software because, on a Wednesday at midnight, this thing never happens. And of course, we built it out to do that. So I do think that we need to be a lot more intelligent about how we manage for risk. And I think that needs to bleed into everything we do. And it also means that we're going to get things wrong. And we have to also accept that those things happen. So another great example is, the self-drive car, Tesla, the self-drive car, and they had that car accident where that guy died. And it was all over the news. Oh, it's a disaster. how many car accidents do we have in the US with human beings all the time, right? You have to make a choice. You could drive incredibly slowly, like I was going to say like my grandma, but she drives quite quickly. But and my mother-in-law, don't get in the front of her; she would destroy it. But anyway, but you could drive really slowly, and you kind of like say, well, life's a risk. I'm going to make certain choices, and I think that also talks about that. And obviously, agility, but I'm biased, would be at the heart of a modern, more intelligent, risk-based approach.
Yeah. Now, before we started this conversation, you and I were talking a bit about the agility aspect of it and the focus, whether it's on the method, the mindset, or the results. What's your take on that?
It's funny that Agile is ultimately all about managing in the unknown, right? It's all about managing in uncertainty. And I think that the disciplines of Agile, things like Scrum, this method kind of stuff, ultimately is just there to get you that mindset, to think about this very much, that to make you realize uncertainty. There's a certain exercise in our professional Scrum Master training that Ken Schwaber, the creator of Scrum with Jeff, created, and I can't tell you what the exercise is because it's one of those oh my gosh exercises, but it's all about making you realize you're a lying, cheating person. I was going to use an expletive, best not do that on a public thing, but you're lying and cheating, and ultimately I think that you realize that there's a lot of false assumptions in the way we approach work. You talk about that in your book, the Dummies book, about decision making, the fact that we often make decisions, we pretend that we're making them based on all these facts, but really it's just a gut feeling and we're using those to justify it. Ultimately we need to step back and we need to say, hey, whenever we do anything, we've got some challenges and risk and unknown that we're dealing with, and we need to explicitly manage that. And I think Agile is about that. It's about being very explicit and being very transparent about those things. And ultimately, it's a mindset that's reinforced by some discipline, which the methods obviously highlight.
Right. So it's very much about focusing on the results.
Yeah, the outcomes, really. And hopefully those outcomes are with the customer. We should be measuring not just the cycle time of getting work done, which often we maniacally focus on with things like velocity. We should be focusing on the time, a colleague of mine says, the time to learning, the time that we're actually taking this hypothesis, delivering it to our customers, learning from it and getting that feedback back. Which is, I think that's the thing that we need to be very conscious of. And if you're in a risky situation, then that is ultimately, you're sort of nervous until people start using it, until enough people start using it, until that situation happens, and you need to get that, and obviously you try to force that earlier with a smaller subset. Like the Amazon solution, where you deliver to a very small subset functionality continuously, you're delivering, and then you see if they're all right, and then you switch it on, you switch it off, and you make decisions like that. So you're a lot more proactive.
We're talking also about I did the webinar for Agile India in the middle of November on a Friday night at 8 o'clock. So I'm astounded that anybody showed up. But the conversation there was about pivoting to an Agile leadership through decision making. And of course, what most of the line of questions that came in had to do with this worldview of traditional command and control, and then we've got over on the other side the letting go of control in order to reclaim it through flexibility, agility, and so forth. That's a big shift. So when you're working with executives, what's your experience around bridging those two different worldviews so that the new world looks friendly and approachable?
There is this definite change, but I don't see it at the exec level. Executives kind of want this. They're very, now whether they actually do it is a different question, but they definitely really, you say to them, okay, we want to empower your teams to make decisions. And they're like, yeah, that sounds great. They've never wanted to make decisions. They need to make decisions. They're closer to the problem. Let's go to it. If you give this sort of list of Agile characteristics, you need to, rejoice in failure or learning. You need to deliver smaller chunks. You need to plan broader in terms of vision, but smaller in terms of actually what you're going to actually do. You need to, you talk about all these things with them, and they're like, yeah, they get it. The challenge that I find is that the amorphous blob of middle management, and I say that in an endearing way, though it doesn't sound very
just in case somebody's feeling blobby at the moment. Yes.
No, I just think, and they have a very hard time because these executives have this grand vision. And they say all the right things, but ultimately they then ask for the middle managers to, when's that project going to be done? Exactly, 100%. We don't want any, we're planning everything on this. It needs to be 100% done. You're like, okay, that's interesting. And then, okay, well, we need this. Can't you just move these people around, these resources around? Can't Bob work on those 5 projects? Can't, So they're sort of living in this middle world, this sort of like where the rubber meets the road. And it's incredibly difficult for them. Agile is actually about a lot more discipline, but on the day-to-day basis, the system kind of disciplines sort of disappear in favor of result-based disciplines, such as, delivering valuable software frequently, looking at it, talking about it with your stakeholders, getting that feedback back into the loop, planning frequently. All of this is very disciplined, but it's less about the process and more about the teams. It's less about the, those milestones, those events, those circumstantial indicators, and more about the actual indicators themselves. So it is a significant change. It's hard for them, and if you believe some of my colleagues, from some other communities, and I was going to say, but I best not, they would say just get rid of middle management, get rid of them. There's no value that they add, but they do add value. They provide a lot of structure in a world that is often unstructured. They provide, they help their teams if they're effective middle managers. Bottom line, though, is that they need to be equipped to make the right decisions. They need to be equipped to use, their bosses need to stop asking them, talking out both sides of their face, as it were. And then, if they're allowed to do that, then I think they will be successful. But it's a tricky problem.
One of my other programs here was with Michael Pakinowski, not on this podcast, but on my previous one. And we were talking about the fact that in a 7-tier organization, from a bureaucratic point of view, by level 4, the executives can no longer see what the impact of decisions has on the marketplace, on the customer. So if there's a role for middle management to play, it's to continually connect those dots up so that these, the view is in sight. Actually know what terrain you're on with respect to the customer values.
And isn't that an interesting point? What you said was, I think, very, very interesting. It sort of goes back to something else we were talking about before the show, or the fact that we're sort of inverting organizations now. We're sort of turning them over, and we're turning them to customer centric, and that means that the only people that are valuable really are the people, or the most valuable people are the people that are directly interacting with the customers, either directly servicing them or delivering products that are directly servicing them. They're sort of like that level, and everybody else is helping them. So you can almost think that it's sort of inverted, as it were. So instead of a traditional hierarchy that's a sort of a pyramid going down until you're right at the bottom and you're kind of like just doing everything, you'd sort of turn it up where these people are the most important people because they're the people that are directly connected to the customer. The fact is, just to use a supermarket analogy, the most important people in supermarkets are not the executives, they're the people that are working on the till. They're people, selling the tinsel. They're the people, making sure the shopping trolleys are in the right place. They're the people that are making sure the products are on the thing. Everybody else is superfluous to that. And I think, to use an Amazon, it's so funny that they, at their busiest times, everybody's, packing boxes, and everybody cares about that, and customers, and it really does make a huge difference. It really does. Just that culture of everybody caring about the customer, knowing that the customer is the number one, and we give great lip service to it. But the Agile revolution, I think, will really gain huge momentum when we connect those two, that focus on customers and that empirical empowered team kind of model. Those two things are if you get that together, that's what it's all about, right?
Well, I can't agree with you more, but at the same time, when you're saying this, the first thing that comes to my mind is, all right, we've got this huge focus, at least in big companies, on shareholder value. That's the mantra. And of course, yes, when most of us kind of go, oh yeah, that's the fundamental source of a lot of disengagement, because that's not value to the many, that is value to the few. So if what's the pivot, in your experience, what's the pivot between at the mindset, both the board level and the executive level, and in the cultural, really the beliefs that are embedded in cultural decision making, away from, or to broaden it out from shareholder value to real value in the customer and in the society?
I don't really have an answer, because unfortunately what you've said is and we continuously reinforced that focus by changing the way in which that value is taxed even, so ultimately I think the control of capital is fundamentally reducing the ultimate long-term value of the companies. A great example is GE, right? Jeff Emmett was doing an amazing job, in my opinion, delivering a transformation. In fact, he navigated GE through some very turbulent times, obviously September 11th, a huge energy crisis, 2007 with some businesses that weren't necessarily created for, dare I say, success, the capital part of his business, etc. And he maniacally focused on transforming the organization to an information-rich organization, a company that is very digital by its very nature, and, trying to change it. And he was pushed out by an investor, by a rogue, a relatively small owner as well of GE stock. And because he wasn't getting from the gut, the previous CEO's return, the level of shareholder return that you would expect. And so there's no short and easy answer. Obviously the answer that everybody gives when asked this question is that long-term value, share value, is sustained by a maniacal focus on the customer. Focus on employees first, who then service the customer best to the best of their abilities, which then drives up value of the company and ultimate profitability. The reality, though, is that most investors aren't long-term investors; they're short-term investors, and that means that you get a fundamental disconnect between those two things. So I don't have any answers for that, other than if you do the right thing does you. That's what I always hope. Again, a grandma expression, and I think that by servicing your customers effectively, it really does end up doing the right thing. And it is, though, ironic that every time I try to use a different company, I can't just use Amazon for this stuff. I'm frequently disappointed because customer seems to be a mystery to a lot of these organizations that are more focused on cost and efficiency and all of these things, which I'm like, no, these things come if you do the customer thing right, but they shouldn't come instead of the customer.
And it's funny because when you talk about that, I'm drawn back to a quote I think I put in one of the Huffington Post articles I wrote on companies that mimic life principles, using principles of life in their cultural DNA. And it was a quote by Paul Pullman, who had been questioned by a short-term investment person who sort of said, hey, if I invest in your company, how fast can I see money? He says, just don't invest in us. Don't go there, because we're here for the long haul. And we're not here for the short turnaround. And so if you can't support our goals in the long run, don't bother. And it was brilliant. I'm paraphrasing, and you'd be much better off reading the real quote as opposed to listening to my version of it. But it was really brilliant leadership stand on here's what we stand for and here's what we don't stand for. So as boundary setting goes, it was brilliant.
And actually, there's also a great quote. This is by Kiichi Tokoda, the second president of Toyota, and they were in the loom business. And I think that this is really interesting about length of sort of investment and a sort of focus on that. And so some thieves had stolen some of the loom designs, or left the company and the like. And he says the thieves may be able to follow the design plans and produce a loom, but we are modifying and improving our looms every day. They do not have the expertise gained from the failures it took to produce the original. We need not be concerned. We need to only continue, as always, making our improvements. So basically, this sort of like more long-term focus, this ultimate, the journey. And there's a lot of people that want to shortcut the sort of route to Agile and the route to customer centricity and shortcut all of that stuff. But ultimately, I don't think you can. I think that learning, that engagement with the customer, every time what do they say? Every time you have an argument with your wife, you learn something new if you're smart, but the point is that it's that sort of journey with your customer, and you have to have that kind of relationship that sustains that, and that sort of changes everything if you think in that way. And yeah, I think that long-term shareholder value is something we need to seek, but not if we incentivize capital gains the way we do, and not if we incentivize investments and hedge funds the way we do, unfortunately. But anyway, I can't change those things, I'm afraid.
But what you are speaking to is the importance of the metrics in torquing or tweaking or driving the dynamics inside a company, and the focus for decision making. So that's important. So if you're incentivizing something, you want to know what the dynamic is. What's the interaction that you create by incentivizing something? Because frequently the idea is to incentivize, but the actual outcomes do not work well. So they do the incent part, but they don't observe what the results are, and that's where the insights are gained for any kind of adjustments, or if we're going to use that word again, the agility word that sort of says we need to switch around here and go a different direction.
Yeah, it's people often say, what's the most important single thing for becoming agile? What should we focus on? And I think one of the most important things is to think about what you're measuring. I think that I've recently been doing some work with Jeff Gothard. I wrote a blog with him, and Lean UX is one of the books that he's written. And one thing that's interesting about Lean UX is and his philosophy. It's about thinking about how you can instrument the results. Thinking about the measures, and then using those measures to feed back into a process, sense and respond. That's sort of like that loop that he talks a lot about, because you need those measures in place to incentivize the right changes to the behavior. But they're hard, because if you concentrate on things like velocity, which is obviously scrum.org, we're known for being, Scrum is known for being velocity, but I don't actually like velocity. I use it like everybody, but ultimately I care about that learning and that real value that we're trying to deliver, and trying to get that back into so I can make, using an empirical process, the right decisions at least every 2 weeks in terms of what I'm focused on next. And I think that getting those measures is crucial, but they're very hard to get. Imagine, writing a list of things that you want, not in terms of the things that you want, but the outcomes that they provide. I tried to do that with my 4.5-year-old the other day. We were talking about Santa's list, and I said, okay, you want he wants a lot of things, and why do you want this particular toy? And he looked at me and said, because I do. And I remember that, and I was like, no, but why? What are you going to do with it? What things are you going to, what games, what adventures are you going to have with it? And then he looked at me and said, loads, and loads that I don't even know yet. Don't be so stupid, Dad. But we have to. And then I gave up and went back to SpongeBob and all his friends. But what we need to do is we need to think about this list of wants, not in terms of the want, but in terms of the outcome it's trying to achieve. And then we need to say, how do we measure that outcome to be effective? And I'm not saying spend millions of hours thinking about it, dressed in robes or anything. But it's sort of like you need to think a bit about that, and then you bring that into your process, and then voila, magic happens.
Exactly. One of the things that I see a lot of, and it's very easy to see, is coming from the outside into organizations, is patterns. Things that are going on in the organization, running on autopilot, running the organization on autopilot, and yet can often actually not serve the organization well in terms of responding to fast changing conditions or surprises that come flat out of nowhere. And of course, in a period of time where we've got this kind of exponential change, massive change going on, you really have to know where these patterns are coming from. Which ones have you witnessed that get in the way of faster responsiveness? And a lot of companies are actually working against themselves, I noticed as well, holding them in place. What do you see there?
Talking about variability is a really interesting thing. The fact that most systems aren't built for variability, and as you increase the variability, the ability of the system to respond to it drops. And the reason why we use an empirical approach to software delivery, which is what Scrum and Agile and the like is because that is all about dealing with that lack of certainty and variability. But it's interesting, you're asking for particular things that I see. Obviously, the annual planning cycle is ridiculously it's like an anti-pattern of biblical proportions, as you know. And I'm not saying you shouldn't think about a year, but it should be rolling, and it should be brief. The priorities should be relatively easy to determine, and they shouldn't be bottom up, they should be top down. Yes, there are some things that will, you're going to have to, there's some non-discretionary spending that you're going to have. Now, depending on the life cycle, depending on where your products are, depending on your maturity, that non-discretionary spending will happen. But when it comes to discretionary spending, spending months doing planning is just a stupid idea, particularly as you have no idea what's going to happen in a year's time. Instead, what you need to do is determine your priorities at a broad level, and then you need to allocate funds based on those broad priorities, call them products for want of a better word, and then you need to just allow those teams to determine what's the most important things for those areas, and then hopefully if they're empowered and they're connected to the customer, they'll make the right decisions. If they're not, you'll see it, because they'll be delivering the wrong decisions frequently, and you're going to get rapid feedback and instrumentation, data will support that. So I think annual planning is another thing. The other thing that's really interesting, the maniacal focus on efficiency as manifest in automation. Toyota did not use robots to the level that any of its competition did. And only now are they starting to use as much, their automation level was relatively small. Their IT level was relatively small in comparison to the Fords and the General Motors and the like. And you have to ask yourself, well, hang on a minute, I thought they're the poster child of quality, or they're the poster child of lean. But automation and systems and very complex systems get in the way of dealing with reliability, and we spend a great deal of time investing in that in an organization with the remit of efficiency. I don't know, but CRM implementations. How many CRM implementations do you see where you get these forms that you create about customers and about deals and about that are so damn complicated because they're trying to deal with all this stuff because that's more efficient, as opposed to keep it simple and allow sales reps and sales managers, etc., to augment these processes. Minimal, smallest possible instead of most complicated possible. Think to the ultimate solution rather than the simple solution. I see that being a huge pattern that gets repeated over and over again. And you sit in a meeting and it's like, well, we've got to do this and we're going to do this and we're going to do this, instead of what's the smallest thing that we can roll out that gives us the most value. And I think so annual planning, over complexicizing, if that's such a word, which it probably isn't. Those are some patterns that I see over and over again, and probably the same ones that you see as well.
Well, it's funny because I just did an interview with a colleague who works for a Norwegian energy company, and in their company they got rid of budgeting and discovered that they gained what they were doing by doing this budgeting process. They already had great ways of keeping track of performance. And in fact, they're looking at even updating those even more. And I'm looking at a tool right now out of Hungary that actually enables an organization to do that without really bring it down to something simpler. But anyway, they discovered that with budgeting, they were looking 80% of the time they were looking back, 20% they were looking forward. And by getting rid of budgeting, they flipped that. So now 80% of their focus is forward and 20% is back. And that's a huge gain in terms of agility alone, in terms of keeping your head up and seeing what's going on. So that the patterns are these habits. I call them habits, but they're these habits that we're doing them because we've always done them, but we really might want to look at that as reflect on it a bit and say, what do we want to do here?
Yeah, and it's not that you're sort of, you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, you're kind of like, oh my God, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Let's spend hundreds of millions of dollars of time working out what we're going to spend these $100 million on. I can see why all of these things happen. I can, and it makes total sense at some level, but ultimately, yeah, budgeting in particular just drives me mad that they invest so much time, and it often is a complete waste of time. Yeah. Because neither is the problem that they're solving stable or how they're going to solve it stable. So you're like, oh, hang on a minute. Yeah. Well, then why are we spending so much time?
And there's evidence that those companies that invest in, but at least from banks, I have a research document that she provided to me, where banks that do invest in budgeting actually are less profitable. And it all makes sense because you're pouring a lot of money and energy into something that it's a cut and paste exercise. So, But anyway, appreciate that, because now, of course, next question is how do you move traditional executives, or how do you help them release control on things and move into moving flexibly, or to even engaging and adopting a freer outlook and greater autonomy inside their companies?
I think there's one very important point, which is going to really, maybe it'll surprise you, maybe it won't. We talked a little bit about this earlier, so I guess it won't now, Dash. I let the cat out of the bag. But ultimately, I don't think it's about agility. I think you need to, if you want to get your executives to buy into this, and you want to be, and make the right decisions around it, it needs to be driven by customers. I think agility is at its heart about responding to customers in a more effective way. They could be internal customers. They don't have to be people with checkbooks necessarily. Well, not traditional checkbooks. They could be, internal customers. They could be, partners, etc. But citizens, if you're in the government, or whatever, if you're a non-profit, they could be members, but ultimately I think that we need to be more responsive because our customers need us to be more responsive, right? So if you connect agility into that, and it being a set of tools like many other things to helping you effectively manage these very fickle, confused customers in a more effective way, then, and I think that should be the focus. If you get your executives to buy into the need to respond in that way, then everything else just becomes easy. And that obviously then the next logical step is that you start from the edges in your organization. You don't start from the middle. You don't, pick. A lot of these sort of transformations and changes tend to pick the things that are considered to be the least risky, the least, don't rock the boat. And those departments are like managing the internal intranet or the learning management system, which, two people use. You shouldn't. You should start with things that are customer centric, and you should use these techniques because most customers naturally want to work in these, and their proxies, the people that manage those customers naturally want to work in this way. And, they applaud you if you do it if you communicate it without the mumbo jumbo and the words that they really want to. And then if you start at those edges, then you slowly, then the support organizations, you start having some very interesting conversations around dependencies and around support and around, help desks and operations and, all the ancillary finance, HR, all of these things sort of like then have to become more agile to respond to the teams that are agile, that are connected to these customers. So I recommend a very clear sort of customer first kind of agile transformation or agile change or transition, I'd like to describe it as. And I think that if you do that, then not only do you get the benefit of making the right decisions, meaning that you're only doing the things that are just necessary to service the customers in an effective way, you also get the business case naturally sort of like occurring from that. That's my particular take, and there's lots of things that can help do that, whether it's lean startup or lean UX or all of these types of initiatives, DevOps for getting stuff out. All of that stuff just comes. It shouldn't be the focus though. I don't want to do DevOps. I don't want to do Agile. I want to deliver lots of valuable stuff to my customers, have them love me like no other, and then buy more stuff from me, and then allow me to grow and get even more fabulous.
Yeah,
that's possible.
Absolutely fabulous, as it were.
Yes.
Yeah. Any tips you'd like to share for those people who are either they've got this massive tool, and of course the theory is if you just apply the tool all is well, but in fact the tool comes with the person, it comes with their own place where they've come to in terms of their understanding of how to work with agility and so forth, or how to work even with this world today. So any tips that you would suggest to anyone listening to this program on how to move forward with these ideas in a way that edges things along and reduces the shock to the system, shall we say? Yeah,
I think number one is don't give up. I think, this is Thomas Friedman, Thomas Friedman,
Yeah.
awesome, the world is flat. And he wrote a book called Thank You for Being Late. And it's a great book, apart from the last 3 chapters where he goes on about Minnesota for some reason. Anyway, I don't totally know what happened there. But, said that is the model that we need to follow, Minnesota in the 50s. And I'm like, okay. Anyway, but we'll ignore those last 3 chapters. But the start of it's an awesome book. And he's such a good communicator. And he talks about the fact we're in this age of accelerations, right? And, whether it be globalization or whether it be climate change, man-made or not, whether it be Moore's law or the impact of technology on that, and we're in this hugely complex world where things are changing always. And so the first thing I'd always say is, the first tip that I have is like, you're in the great, imagine being a loom maker in the Industrial Revolution, or a steam expert in the Industrial Revolution. You are these people, so get excited about it. Don't be despondent. Of course you're going to be annoyed, and there's going to be people with clogs throwing them at you all the time. But first, don't give up. Get excited. Get excited about this change, because it is. Most of the people that you work with and I work with, and probably maybe listening to this, you're in the middle of it. So one, get excited and be happy that you are, and you're not a long distance truck driver whose job may be replaced by this huge Tesla truck, or a lawyer whose AI is going to potentially replace, or the list goes on. One, get very excited. Two, don't get all religious about it. It's not about Scrum versus XP versus Lean versus this versus that. These are all amazing ideas. Everybody that writes this, well, the majority, maybe not everybody, comes from good place. And we all are trying to help, and we all come from our own point of view. Consider that, and then take these and use these to help you deliver value to the customer. So then remember that it's all about the customer. So when you're communicating to your boss or to your person, your employee, say, hey, so why do we do this daily? Well, why we do this daily, and we'd love you to come, is because we talk about the work that we did yesterday and the work we do tomorrow to help the customer, what stuff we're doing, and you give us this perspective, or you give us this perspective. Let's bring that. Always talk about it from that point of view. And then if you start doing that, you become less that guy talking about method and process, and become that guy talking about customers and helping them do things better. And then, I guess, smile. I think, we have these values in Scrum, and I was very disappointed, courage, focus, commitment, respect, openness. I was disappointed we didn't have humor in that as a value, and maybe get Jeff and Ken, when I introduced the idea, may have possibly told me I was barking mad. But I think that you should smile as you do it, because we're at an amazing time, and yes, there's lots that drive us all batty, but those things will come and those things will go, and you got to have fun doing this, and and laugh at yourself when you make stupid decisions about, hey, what we need to do is we need to do this big mob thing, and then it's a complete disaster, and you're like, oh, well, that didn't work very well, did it? Because, everybody's speaking a different language, or they're all at 8 p.m. on a Friday night because you forgot that everybody's in India. And you're like, oh, what am I doing? But then accept that and go, get rid of the hubris, get rid of the arrogance. And then I think you'll have fun, you'll deliver valuable stuff, you'll make everybody happy and have clear direction, and it'll all be goodness. Anyway, that's my opinion anyway.
That worked for me. Dave, where do people go for more information?
You can always go to www.scrum.org, which is awesome. We have a great blog. We have our professional Scrum trainer community, exactly 204, writing about this stuff every day. I'm fortunate enough that I'm part of a community that gets it, that, Ken Schwaber made a very strong effort to ensure that a certain type of thinkers all came together, and we do that, and we've got a great community. Come and look at our blogs, come and visit our materials, and get into the conversation, but do it with a smile, not a sneer, and then you'll definitely get me chatting and having some fun with you.
I love it. Thanks so much, Dave, for being on the program. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Our conversation today. For more information on what I do, go to FromInsightToAction.com. My work is about business transformation, but it's specifically about connecting personal leadership to making a massive difference in the world, and then adapting the organizational cultures, the business cultures, so they can actually accomplish something other than meet the next quarter. So that's my work. It's much more than that, obviously. I've written for the Huffington Post, Great Workplace Cultures. I have a chapter out in The Intelligence of the Cosmos by Ervin Laszlo on deep dynamics, networks, and epigenetics and decision making, emotions, in other words. And also, I'm looking. I've also written a chapter for Great Workplace Cultures, and just within this last week, an article came out through Business Expert Press in New York called "Successfully Moving to an Executive Role," which is very much around the inner work that people need to do in order to adapt to today's incredible world. So thank you very much for joining me. You can certainly connect with me on LinkedIn, DAWNAH Jones. You can also go to Twitter, EPDAWNA_Jones. And that should be it. And I hope you enjoy the next couple of weeks. We'll talk to you soon. And thank you very much for joining me.